Okay, good morning. Tuesday before spring break, so woo, it's exciting stuff. You know what else is exciting? Grading papers. So I was grading your stuff, and I'm going to mute somebody just in case you say something. I am convinced, and I'm not trying to be rude at all, I'm convinced that you are not paying attention during class, okay? So, and I know occasionally, like I'll ask you a question and, the same two or three of you will respond. I know that doesn't necessarily mean the rest of you aren't paying attention, but here's why I'm convinced that you're not paying attention. Number one, I get emails every week that say, I really don't understand what you mean by the question. Could you explain it to me? Typically, at the beginning of each class, I go over the weekly question and suggest things that you might want to use in the answer. Now, since I do that pretty much every class period, and I record the lectures and I post them, so if you didn't catch it, you can always go back and watch, say, the first 5-10 minutes. It suggests to me that you're not paying attention during class because most of you do attend class. Thing number two that makes me think you're not paying attention. There are some of you that are not doing all the assignments. Like maybe you'll occasionally turn in a weekly question, maybe you turn one in 2 weeks late, and I get it if it's a couple of days late. I had somebody turn in a quiz, the first quiz, a couple of days ago, and no explanation at all. Now, if you're going to be more than a day or so late with something, I need to know about it, and you need to explain to me why. I don't need like all the details, just like, hey, I was busy at work. Hey, my cat was depressed and I was consoling him. Whatever the thing was, just tell me why it was late. You don't even have to give me a big explanation. Maybe just acknowledge that it was late, and that would be good. It's like somebody emailed this morning or last night and said, I thought I turned it in, but I didn't really. Just tell me, whatever's true, just tell me that, okay? So tell me something when your stuff's late. But those of you who aren't doing stuff, we have assignments. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but they're on the calendar. They're on the assignments page. I talk about them every week. So, and I know pandemic, end of your senior year. I know. Lots of stuff. But I've already made this class about as simple as I can make it. I have. So, you write an answer to a question every week. You know the question ahead of time. The only thing that I ask is that you not cheat. Okay, that's point number 3 of the day. A couple people last week turned in stuff 100% plagiarized from another source. I would probably notice this even if your assignment didn't have a plagiarism tracker because you're using words that you don't normally use, and it was the exact same answer as someone else turned in. So don't plagiarize, okay? So don't plagiarize. Do pay attention. If you're not paying attention, maybe go back and look at the recording. It's part of why I record the lectures. And if you turn in stuff late, really late, I don't mean like a day or two, but a month, 2 weeks, something like that, can you send me an email that suggests to me why your stuff is late? We can do this moving forward. You don't have to go back and do it unless you're the 1 or 2 people that I emailed specifically and said, why did you turn this in a month late? Because I kind of would like to know that. Also, you may or may not have noticed, but I make a list of stuff that you should study for the weekly quiz. So I'm going to kind of put that up. That's in the course documents section. And I don't remember what it's called. It's not called list of stuff you should study for the quiz, but it's like unit 2 timed question review, something along those lines. So, and I'm not distressed with you guys in any way. I'm not, it honestly, I'd prefer that you all pass. If you don't, it doesn't change my life in any meaningful way, but it probably might be a problem for you. So I'm trying to make this pretty simple. You've got the weekly questions ahead of time. You've got the list of stuff to study for the quizzes. You have to do the weekly questions. You have to do the quiz. And the quiz I really want on time. Because if you turn in the quiz a month late and your grade is substantially higher than somebody else's, and as many ways as we like to put in where we think we're keeping you from, doing something you shouldn't do, sharing the information, that kind of stuff. I know you're better with technology than I am. I know that you can screenshot stuff and share it with people. So, turning in stuff that late when your grade is substantially higher than all of your other grades is a bad sign to me. So, pay attention during class. If you're not paying attention during class, go back and look at the recordings rather than ask me, like, can you go over all that again with me in an email? Because no, probably not. Make sure you turn in your weekly questions, do your quiz on time or within, a few hours of on time. And let me know if you have concerns. And let me know more than, don't wait a month and turn something in. Tell me why you're turning something in late. And don't forget study sheet for the quiz. Okay, we're going to go over stuff for a minute or two, and then we'll just go over the information for the day. All right. So pay attention. I know it's hard. I get it. I do. And when you're not paying attention, it's recorded. Go back and look at it. Okay. So for those of you that haven't seen this before, this is the quiz review, and it just gives you a list of things that you should probably look over before you take the quiz. So that way you kind of have an idea what might be on the quiz. So, you've got your list from the American Revolution, and it's got a few battles, it's got a few documents, it's got a treaty, it's got some taxes, that sort of stuff. Okay. Chapter 6, you've got Abigail Adams, who you should be okay with at this point anyway. Differences between state constitutions, separation of church and state. So you've got a list of stuff here. Just be sure to look over it. Here, Chapter 7, Articles of Confederation, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Shays Rebellion, Constitution, these fellows' views on the Constitution, compromises in the Constitution, difference between a Federalist and an Anti-Federalist. They are not political parties. They're factions who have opinions about the Constitution. Federalism, division of powers, checks and balances, separation of powers, and that's, kind of the focus of this week's weekly question. Gradual emancipation, notes on Virginia, and then for Chapter 8, just kind of the general stuff about Washington's presidency, the financial plan, what is impressment, Jay's Treaty Whiskey Rebellion. So you've got your list of stuff here. Okay. All right. So I'm just mostly making you aware of that. And those things are in your textbook. Textbook is always a good source because the questions are really directly based on the textbook, not on, stuff you find online or whatever that flashcard thing is that you guys like to do online. I don't know. I can't think of the name of it today. But you also have an index in your textbook. So, it'll help you locate those words more specifically. And I think the online version of the textbook probably has a glossary. I honestly can't remember. Okay. All right. So there's stuff to help you. And then weekly question. There we go. All right. So weekly questions. How did the framers of the Constitution balance competing claims, local self-government, sectional interest, and national authority? And then for the last chapter, who was John Marshall? What makes him significant? We'll talk more about that next time. So today is Constitution Day. Yeah, Constitution. All right. Do you guys have any questions about anything before we get started besides Can you hear the lecture again about why you need to pay attention? I might do that at any moment. Are you paying attention?
Do we have a quiz, like a test this week? Or is it going to be
Yes,
after spring break?
this Friday.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it should open tomorrow or well, yeah, I guess tomorrow, midnight tonight, if you really wanted to start, and should be open until Friday. Clearly you can take it late because someone took the first one a couple of days ago. Not cool. Not cool. Okay. Yeah, we had this discussion last time and decided maybe you agreed. It seemed like you agreed. To go ahead and do the quiz before you go, and then that last weekly question. If you need to do that during spring break, that's no problem. The theory was you're not going to study during spring break and you're more likely to forget, but could be a pessimistic theory. I don't know. All right. So some stuff to talk about related to the Constitution. So I know sketchy notes, but this gives you a chance to fill in your notes as we go along and pay attention. I know that's going to be the key word of the day, isn't it? All right. So under the Articles of Confederation, and I feel like we've probably already talked about that a little bit, but under the Articles, oh, sorry for the big yawn. Under the Articles of Confederation, the main idea was to create a loose league of friendship, as the book quotes several times from the document. And their fear was that the government would be too strong, the federal government would be too strong, the same way that George III was too powerful. So they didn't want to create a tyrannical central government that controlled the states. So they intentionally created a government where the states had more power than the federal government. It was really hard to pass laws. There's only one branch of the government. There wasn't a executive branch, there wasn't a judiciary, there was just a legislature. Each state in the legislature had the same amount of votes, they all had one. And because they all had equal representation, the states with more population couldn't really control the states with smaller population. And so really, people considered their citizenship to be their state. So like, I'm a citizen of Virginia, or I'm a citizen of Rhode Island, rather than I'm a citizen of the United States. So it really didn't build any national unity. And that they didn't care. They thought of themselves as their own kind of small countries or independent states, I suppose. So I guess sort of like the CIS now is now Commonwealth of Independent States. So what old people think of as the former Soviet Union. So they wanted to maintain their autonomy, but they did this at the expense of national unity. So and we mentioned last time the Northwest Ordinance was pretty unique because it bans slavery, also sets up townships that set up public schools. So there certainly are some things that happened under the Articles of Confederation that went well. Some of the land ordinances they talk about in your book, 1785, this Northwest Ordinance, a couple of other times where they're adding land, they're setting the qualifications for becoming a state, for applying for territorial status and becoming a state. So they're doing some good things, but it's very hard to accomplish things like treaties. We mentioned that there are problems with finances, that you couldn't force the rest of the country to use the national currency. So having a national currency wasn't terribly useful for anyone, and especially problematic for soldiers because they got paid in that and no one accepted it. Or, well, it's not that no one accepted it, the exchange rate was really low. And the national government under the Articles could levy tax, or they couldn't levy taxes. They could ask for taxes, but they didn't have the ability to collect them. So it was problematic. Now, we did win the American Revolution under the Articles of Confederation. So I promise you, it wasn't a complete loss, but Shays' Rebellion, or Shays's Rebellion, depending on who writes it and how they like to write it, because Shays was with the S, that was the guy's last name, Daniel Shays. So it's his rebellion. And he's that military veteran fellow who lived in rural Massachusetts. His farm was being taxed pretty heavily. He was about to have his farm foreclosed on. And he felt like that was unfair because he had fought for freedom. And then, the immediate result for him was that he lost his farm. And he wasn't just your average, like, I fought for a couple of weeks kind of guy. There was no average, I fought for a couple of weeks kind of guy. But he was a well-known veteran as well. He was a highly decorated veteran. So people knew who he was, and people were frustrated on his behalf. Now, eventually, the Massachusetts legislature will change some of the taxation laws, but that's not before there is a pretty big rebellion and thousands of people are arrested and courts are shut down, and national figures begin to discuss this. So if we can't put down a small rebellion in Massachusetts, then what is the purpose of having this federal government? How are we going to be able to protect our country when we can't even protect ourselves from a small internal rebellion? And many of the founding fathers, most notably George Washington, James Madison, and Henry Knox, who was a big military guy, thought that Shays' rebellion was a call for change. The one guy who really didn't, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, who said, sometimes people disagree and we work through it. Or the way he said it was, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So sometimes people rise up. If they get put down, it means that they probably were wrong. If their cause is a winning cause, it means that we probably needed to change. But most people didn't feel the same way as Jefferson did, and we can say that a lot about Jefferson. And they decided that they would discuss the changes needed in the Articles of Confederation. They had a meeting at Annapolis in, when was it? September, I think. And not so many states showed up, only 6. So they called for a convention in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, the following May, which is the Constitutional Convention, what we think of as the Constitutional Convention. So a whole bunch of people get together for the Constitutional Convention. And as you're writing the weekly question, open the book to see if I can find the nice spot here that will help you. When you're writing the weekly question, it's asking about federalism and balance of power, that kind of stuff. Your book is really, really specific about this. So, and I typically try to pick a weekly question that has really specific stuff in it because, it's easier that way. It is. I'm not trying to trick you on the weekly question. I'm really trying to get you to spend a little more time in your textbook. That's really the goal. Okay. So if you start on page 265, division and separation of powers, that's section 265, and it will go through and talk about some other stuff, final document, Federalist, anti-Federalist. So really just 3 or 4 pages will probably get you some pretty good information. And I would say, I know I'm trusting that you've read the chapter, but if you reread this section, I think it'll be really helpful as you do the weekly question. Okay. Last time, I'm pretty sure we talked about Virginia plan, New Jersey plan, that sort of stuff. Constitutional Convention attendees, I know that we mentioned before, and a couple of you have already answered this question, and you pointed out that these guys are not your average folks. They tended to be substantially better educated than the average folks. Talks about this on 263. They maybe a little bit older than the average person. I mean, it mentioned, of course, like Ben Franklin was a lot older than the average person, but all of these folks were 40s or 50s when your average life expectancy was probably not much more than that during this time period. They had more money than the average person. They were more likely to have military service than the average person, which means that they probably fought in the American Revolution. So they had a personal connection to the fight for independence. And James Madison comes in really prepared. He's the one who wrote the Virginia Plan, studied all of the constitutions of republics throughout history before he showed up at the convention. So he spent about 6 months studying and writing his version of the Constitution. And you see a lot of that in the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan was, it suggested a two-house legislature, both houses by proportion. So based on your population. So the more people you had, the more representatives you got. The smaller states didn't like that. They really liked that equal representation. So we end up with something called the Grand Compromise, which is where they have the two-house legislature, which is the Virginia plan, but one of those houses, the Senate, is equal representation. So that way you kind of have a mix, and you probably know they end up with different terms and that sort of stuff. So Senate terms are 6 years, House terms are 2 years, and we reelect the entire House every 2 years, and we reelect a third of the Senate every 2 years. So they devise all that stuff to kind of mix things up, which is also part of the weekly question. So you want a balance of representation that's proportional and equal, and they do that. And I don't know if you follow politics very much, but you may have noticed that they're in the process of passing a stimulus bill right now, and the Senate seems to have more power than the House sometimes in some of this type of legislation. And it's because the smaller states have more voice there, so little states can make more of a difference in the negotiation there. So the founding fathers do this intentionally because they want to make sure that different constituencies are represented in different ways. It's also why they decided that the president would be sort of elected by popular vote, not by the states, but that the electoral college would be created just in case the states went a little nutty and elected someone that they probably should not elect. So this is kind of a check and balance on the voice of the people, just in case the people go a little rogue or a lot rogue. And if you're wondering, is there ever an instance where the founding father generation kind of looks at this and says, thank goodness we did this? There is. It's coming up later on. There are compromises regarding slavery. The book talks about that quite a bit. You have to know that people have known since before we wrote the Constitution, before we wrote the Articles of Confederation, before we were a country, that slavery and freedom clearly contradict each other. So people understood that writing a constitution for a country that wanted to be free and said that people are endowed by their creators with certain unalienable rights, but allowed slavery was problematic. So there were lots of discussions about slavery, how long slavery should last, how long the slave trade should last. The assumption among this founding generation seemed to be that slavery was a problem that needed to be solved. The legality of slavery was a problem that needed to be solved, but not yet. So the thought was, if you waited until the union was strong, until the country was strong, and then worked through this, that would be better for the country. Clearly, it wouldn't be any better for slaves, but it would be better for the country. So establish the country, create this national unity, and then work on ending slavery. The 3/5 clause was determined through negotiation, and this allowed the southern states to count 60% of their slaves for purposes of population. So that's representation in the House, but of course they weren't allowing slaves to vote. They also discussed when the slave trade should end, and they decided that the slave trade should be allowed to continue for 20 years. All of these compromises, and even as the book points out, the word slavery itself isn't even used in the document because they really felt like that would, uh, what is the word that they use? Let's see, contaminate the glorious fabric of American liberty. So if the words did it, it's interesting that they didn't think the institution did. But the truth is, they really did understand that the institution was problematic. They just were not willing to get rid of it because they didn't want to lose Southern support for the Constitution. So um, the, sorry, peeking at the book here. So the 3/5 clause counted the 3/5 of the population. The Slave Trade and Commerce Compromise allowed Congress to levy certain taxes in exchange for the slave trade, excuse me, ending within 20 years. And this is an unwritten compromise, but in 20 years, the president, who was Thomas Jefferson, did sign a bill to end the slave trade. Now, ending the slave trade doesn't end slavery. It ends the foreign importation of slaves. So there's lots of discussion about slavery in the writing of the Constitution, in the debates over the Constitution, but the words slave and slavery, neither of those words are in the Constitution. So, and of course, that's going to continue to be the problem that divides the nation as the states continue to argue about slavery, and as we add states, you know how this goes. And the Electoral College, there are electors that are ratified by the individual states that really, I guess, certify the election essentially. So they vote, and they tend to vote. There are rules in the modern era that require them to vote the same way that the people voted. However, during that time period, those rules didn't exist. It wasn't a problem, especially in the first election, which was pretty much unanimous. You know, when they wrote the Constitution, they understood who the first president was going to be. It was very clear. And Washington was kind of one of those guys that happens hopefully once in a generation, if you're lucky, who's just sort of the natural leader. And I think you may recognize that person more on a local level, like, you know, he's the guy that everyone always seems to agree should be class president, or, you know, he's the one that when nobody has water, he's leading the bottled water drive or something like that. You know, he's just that nice, selfless leader sort of person that everyone just recognizes. And he tends to put everyone else in front of himself, that sort of thing. And Washington in the founding generation was clearly that guy. If you want to, I know, book review, we need to talk about that too. But there's a book called Founding Brothers that talks about the interrelationship between the founding fathers. And I think that gives a pretty good indication of why it is that people admired Washington. He wasn't the wealthiest, he wasn't the best educated, he surely wasn't the smartest guy. I'm not saying he was dumb, he wasn't. I mean, you know, I think Jefferson is fairly obviously brilliant, and Adams is an amazing lawyer, and Hamilton's very gifted. Washington's just sort of that best of everything put together. But when they were designing the office of the president, they had an understanding that he would be the one that held it. And picking the vice president was going to be tricky. Also, when they first do presidential elections, the winner is president and the runner-up is vice president. You know that doesn't last very long. That's one of the first amendments to the Constitution, is to change that, because that's not terribly effective. When the book starts to talk about Federalist and Nationalist, or Federalist and or Federalist and Nationalist are the same group, and then Anti-Federalist, this is not political parties. this has to do with people who favored the ratification of the Constitution and people who did not favor the ratification of the Constitution. Now, not all of the states, we know Rhode Island didn't even come to the Constitutional Convention, so it technically is illegal. However, because of the ideas of common law, once a document's accepted, once it's used for a certain amount of time, it's accepted. So, you can't go around saying that Constitution doesn't apply to me because Rhode Island didn't show up. We've used it for several hundred years, so we're clearly content with it. And when they start the Constitution, or the opening line of the Constitution is "We the people." The original opening line was "We the states," but they wanted to really show that this was a document for all the people, not for the states individually. And they wanted to create this sort of national unity. And of course, the preamble outlines the goals of the Constitution to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. So there's a list of things the Constitution's supposed to do, which include the big three: protection of life, liberty, and property. Now, not everybody was super excited about the Constitution. The Federalists and Nationalists, they kind of the same people, they wanted the Constitution. So that's what Federalist signifies during this time period. Later on, it's going to mean something else, which is all I know, it's confusing. But during this time period, a Federalist is someone who favors the adoption of the Constitution. An anti-federalist is somebody who opposes the adoption of the Constitution. And there's a really nice map on page 271 in your book that shows where the Federalists and anti-federalists kind of hung out. And the Federalist majority folks tended to be in cities. It's not completely true, but it's pretty true. And the anti-federalists tended to be in the country, or they might have been large slave owners, or they may have been in states that seemed to wield a lot of power under the old system and less under the new. Most people were probably somewhere in the middle. Yeah, that seems to be where most people hang out a lot of times. Now, the Federalist Papers were written as pieces of propaganda to persuade voters that it was necessary to adopt the Constitution. These papers, the Federalist Papers, were written under a pen name Publius, which essentially means the public or a citizen. And they were written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wrote most of them, about half, maybe a little more than half. Madison wrote 30 or so, and then John Jay, who will become the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later on, because you're going like, I never heard of him, probably. But he's more important, I think, than we give him credit for, but that's fine. He writes treaties and things like that too. It's kind of what we did with the Supreme Court at first when they didn't really do too much stuff. But they wrote these essays and made sure they got published, in lots of public places, were read out loud, put in newspapers, that sort of stuff. So it was really a propaganda campaign to push for the ratification of the Constitution. Now, there was still a pushback against the Constitution that maybe it had created too strong of a federal power and not strong enough of state and individual powers. So the biggest thing that anti-federalists will achieve in their opposition to the Constitution is the push for something called a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights. So one of the arguments that the anti-federalists will consistently make is that there is not enough protection of individual liberty, and you will not be able to govern yourselves. So the Bill of Rights was added to make sure that individual rights were protected. Now, Madison was not in really in favor of the Bill of Rights. He thought that if you wrote a Bill of Rights, that if you left out a right, then it might mean that people didn't exactly get that right. So he was really more proponent of the idea of negative liberty, the idea that if you don't make a list of rights, then people automatically have all of their rights. But once you start making that list of rights, if you leave one out, if it's not specifically listed, then people don't have that right. And there was a lot of concern that wealthy people would be able to dominate this government without the Bill of Rights. And probably what we've seen throughout history is that wealthy people tend to dominate government because they have more free time to dominate government. Plus, wealth sometimes, okay, always brings influence. So we've noticed that as well. But the Bill of Rights ends up being written because the state of New York is insistent that they will not sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And if you're thinking, well, does that really matter? Like, yeah, New York really matters because there's a lot of people there and because the financial center of the United States is there as well. So there's a big discussion about what should be in the Bill of Rights, who should write it. And what they end up deciding is that James Madison should probably write it. Part of the reason that James Madison should be the fellow who writes the Constitution is so that the style and the philosophy will continue through. He is not, again, convinced that it's necessary, but he does decide that he'll take on the task of writing it. If you're familiar with the Bill of Rights, it's even if you're not, it's still true. First 10 amendments of the Constitution. Madison wrote 11, they accepted 10. The 11th eventually becomes the 27th, like 200 years later, which is sort of weird, but oh well. The first 5, 6, 7, yeah, 8. Protect your individual liberties. The First Amendment is freedom of speech and press, assembly, petition, and religion. Did I say all of those things? It has 5 things in it. So Second Amendment, it's Texas, so you know what that is. The Third Amendment says the government can't force you to quarter soldiers in your house. And I'm not going to ask you what each individual amendment means. It's, government class might do that, but, I don't have that many questions on the quiz, so I wouldn't want to, use all of them on the Constitution. I would actually, but it doesn't seem like the right thing to do because I kind of think the Constitution is super important. 4th, 5th, 6th, and 4th through 8th amendments talk about your protection if you're accused of a crime or if you end up having to go to court. So, they can't arrest you without cause. There has to be a warrant or probable cause. They have to follow due process when you get arrested. You can call witnesses. You have the right to a speedy trial. And then if things don't go well, there can't be cruel and unusual punishment. And then the 9th and 10th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is the one where Madison's just nervous that he might have left something out. So it essentially says, if I left something out, you have that freedom as well. And the 10th Amendment says any power not specifically given to the federal government belongs to the state government or the local government or the individual. It's kind of Texas's favorite amendment, the 10th Amendment. So we can say 10th Amendment, no masks, or, whatever it is that we want to say, which it's legitimate. I mean, I'm not saying that it isn't, but Texas in particular is a big fan of the 10th Amendment and the second, as we all know. And because New York ends up signing the document after pretty heated discussion at their constitutional convention, each state has a constitutional ratification convention. And for a few of the states, it was kind of pretty simple, but there's really strong dissent in 3 of the larger, more populated states, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. The states who voted against the Constitution were Rhode Island and North Carolina, but it really didn't matter because Rhode Island has nobody in it, and North Carolina also, low on the population list. So they didn't want to be left out, so they ended up signing on because what else were they going to do? And Rhode Island just has that tradition of dissenting anyway. But once the Constitution is signed, anti-federalism goes away because the purpose of anti-federalists was to ensure that the Constitution was not ratified or signed. So once it was signed, it was out. Okay. So Bill of Rights, and when these states signed the Constitution, the Bill of Rights was not written yet. They signed it with the agreement of adding a Bill of Rights, which they followed through on. And you've noticed a couple of things maybe that they have said, we're going to sign this, but you have to do this later. One was end the slave trade in 20 years, which they did do. And one was sign the bill or add the Bill of Rights, the defined unalienable rights. And they did that as well. So now those had to be ratified the same way the Constitution was, but that wasn't a very big issue because that was the reason some of the larger states agreed to the Constitution. So they were definitely going to follow through. And the chapter ends with a discussion of national identity, that idea of we the people, trying to pull the idea of citizenship to the national government rather than the state government. But then the book talks about are Native Americans included in citizenship. That's going to be a big no. And it talks about how the US government dealt with Native Americans, certainly signed treaties, gave land, or I don't want to say gave land, clearly they took away land, but then they maybe granted reservation land somewhere else, farther west. So they will say I don't know what the right word to say is, the way the federal government would say it was, they relocated lots of Native Americans. They did give annuities or federal annual grants to certain tribes, depending on, it mentions in the Treaty of Grenville that that's what happens. And the goal of pushing Native Americans farther west was to open up land to white Americans who were moving west, but also create a farming tradition for those Native Americans. And it seems from the earliest time period of the US government that the goal of the United States for Native Americans was to help them become small farmers, just the same way that the average American was supposed to become a small farmer. And of course, that's not exactly how that's going to work out. African Americans gaining citizenship, there's a push for gradual emancipation during this time period in the northern states. And this, of course, is what it sounds like, that African Americans will become free. Most of the states in the North had a plan for gradual emancipation that either freed slaves at a certain age or in a certain year. However, citizenship was restricted to free white people. So there were some states that allowed African Americans, free blacks, to vote in state elections. They were not allowed to vote in national elections. And if the book mentions for the first century, pretty much any white person was eligible for citizenship, but non-white people were not. And there's a lot of discussion of race toward the end of the chapter, and discussion of race it's kind of the founding problem because of slavery, because of interactions between people of different races. I mean, it was well known during this time period that Thomas Jefferson's, I don't know, the girlfriend is the right word, but I guess we'll go with it. Um, After his wife died early. She was young, and then he became friendly with Sally Hemings. And this, by all accounts, was a consensual relationship, and they ended up having children together. Jefferson frees a few of his kids, but doesn't free the mother of his children. Washington will end up freeing the slaves, his slaves, sorry, not these slaves, that really came from his wife's estate, but not until after she died. So, they had different views on slavery. Certainly, founding fathers like Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, typically the New Yorkers and the Pennsylvanians, were opposed to slavery, and mentions that Thomas Jefferson had an interaction, really famous interaction, with a mathematician, city planner named Benjamin Banneker, who's a free Black man who helped to plan Washington, D.C. And they exchanged letters after Banneker read some of Jefferson's ideas about race in the Notes on Virginia, where he talked about why Blacks were inferior to whites intellectually. And then Banneker said, I uh, beg to differ with you, and sent him a copy of a few books that he'd written. And then Jefferson said, yeah, you're a brilliant man, and you are an aberration. You're a special cause, essentially. So you're the exception to the rule, which probably isn't exactly what Banneker was aiming for, but there certainly were lots of discussions about slavery, the place of slavery in the Republic. I guarantee you that Jefferson thought that he was a humane slave owner, that he treated his slaves well. Madison struggled with the idea of slavery, but he knew slavery was wrong, but his wealth came from slaves, and he doesn't free all of his slaves either. And a lot of these founding fathers will believe that slaves eventually need to be freed, but that whites and blacks should not mutually coexist. So they're going to believe in the idea of colonization, which we'll definitely talk about later. Okay. So that is pretty much it for chapter 7. That's a lot of stuff. I know. And the next chapter also a lot of stuff as well. But before we stop for the day, let me just kind of note that for chapter 8, clearly I made better notes for chapter 8. I don't remember why I just did the list for 6 and 7, but hopefully you were able to fill in some stuff. But chapter 8 gives you much more full discussion there, and there's a lot of stuff in chapter 8 as well. All right, I'm going to stop the sharing thing now and see if you guys have any questions. I know I started class with telling you you've got to pay attention, and then I talked to you for an hour, but it's the way college goes. I'm sorry. But there's the list of stuff to study. There's a lot of information in the textbook. The textbook, I hate to keep saying I don't know if you've read the textbook, but there's reasons that I keep saying that. The textbook is a really good source of information, and it's nicely written. It's really clear, it's concise, that sort of thing. So it's not like, I know, because I've taught for a long time, the longer I've taught, the less likely it seems that students are to read their textbooks. And you go online and you read little excerpts about the individual things, or you do, what is the flashcard thing that I can't think of that you guys always do? You do stuff like that, but the problem with that is it doesn't connect all the information. And in history, connecting the information really matters. It's also why you remember stuff, if you connect it to other things. So if you can connect history to literature, to science, to math, then you're more likely to remember all of it, strangely enough. All right. I am mostly done, but I want to see if you had any questions before we go. Now is a good time to ask. Okay, don't leave just yet. I want to double check the roll, but I do want to remind you a couple things. Thing number one, if you are not turning in weekly questions, there's essentially one per week. You have to turn them in, okay? I say this because there are a few of you that have turned in one or two, a couple of you maybe none. You're not going to pass. That's half of your points, okay? There are also a couple of you that, for whatever reason, didn't do that quiz, the first quiz. You have to do the quizzes. They're not optional. So the quiz should open to tonight or this morning, 12:01, Wednesday morning, 12:01, and is officially due at midnight on Friday. I would suggest that before you take the quiz, that you go through that list of stuff and look at your textbook, look in the index, where, however you want to go about it, and remind yourself of what those things are, because that will help you as you take the quiz. So study for the quiz. That's what I'm saying. And I've also said this before, but I'm going to say it again. If your weekly questions are good, but your quiz is a little iffy, I'm going to be much more favorable to you than if your weekly questions are terrible and your quiz is really good. And you know why, and you know what I'm saying. So the weekly questions kind of show me that you're digging into the textbook a little, that you're paying attention to the lectures, that you're at least researching one thing per week. The quiz, I would like to think, shows me that you have kind of a general knowledge of the chapter, but if you don't do the weekly questions and you get an A on the quiz, it probably shows me something a little different, which is not what you want to show me, okay? And one more time, if you are going to turn something in weeks late, you need to send an email that explains why, okay? It doesn't have to tell me all the details of your life. You can tell me, like, your cat died. It could tell me, you had to work more, that you got behind in physics. I mean, something honest would be nice. I've even had somebody email that said, you know what, honestly, I just wasn't feeling it and I was kind of lazy, but I'm going to do better moving forward. And they did. So if you say that, you actually, it'd be cool if you actually did better moving forward. But, we all have those moments. All right. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask? I'm going to double check the roll really quick. I didn't see Cannon McDonald. Did I see him? No, I didn't see Jessica Romero. I didn't see, that's it. I think those are the only two people that didn't log on at some point. All right, stay behind and ask questions if you have them. I'll go ahead and stop the recording. So